The airport was alive that morning with its usual chaos, rolling suitcases, echoing footsteps, and the distant hum of announcements calling passengers to gates that promised new destinations and dreams. Among the travelers stood a man whose presence seemed to command attention even in the blur of bodies. His name was Charles Bennett, a tall, dignified black man in his mid-40s, dressed in a crisp charcoal suit that spoke of quiet authority and success. To strangers, he might have looked like any other business traveler on his way to a meeting. But Charles wasn't just another traveler. He was the CEO of Bennett Dynamics, one of the most innovative tech firms in the country, a self-made man who had risen from poverty to power, from being told he would never succeed to leading an empire of his own making. He approached the airline counter with his usual calm smile, holding his boarding pass in a small carry-on bag. "Good morning," he greeted politely. The woman behind the counter, a young white staff member with a forced corporate smile, barely glanced at him before replying in a tone that was a little too sharp, a little too dismissive. "You're in the wrong line, sir. This counter is for first-class passengers only." Charles blinked, momentarily thrown off. He looked up at the glowing sign that clearly said first class, then back at her. "Yes," he said evenly. "That's me." The attendant's eyebrows arched in disbelief. "Oh, of course," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm as she took her passport. "Apologies, sir." She tapped on her keyboard, the smirk never leaving her face. Another staff member, a tall man with a buzz cut, came over and looked at Charles' ticket. He whispered something under his breath, and the woman stifled a laugh. Charles felt the shift, that subtle, invisible current of mockery, that feeling every black professional knew all too well. He straightened his shoulders and stayed silent. Minutes later, Charles made his way toward the VIP lounge, where the same two staffers followed him. He noticed them snickering near the corner, whispering, and taking photos. It wasn't the first time he had experienced racial bias, not by a long shot, but something about this felt different. It was uglier. As he waited to board, one of the airline employees approached with a forced grin and said, "Sir, we're offering complimentary in-lounge services for our elite passengers today, including a quick grooming session before takeoff." Charles raised a brow. "Grooming session?" "Yes, sir. Just a light trim or refresh before your flight. Compliments of our premium program." Normally, he would have declined, but he had a long meeting waiting in London and figured a quick clean-up might not hurt. He agreed, not sensing the trap. They guided him to a small room behind the lounge where a portable barber setup was arranged, a mirror, a chair, clippers, and two attendants laughing softly among themselves. Charles sat down, adjusting his tie, unaware that this moment, this single, seemingly harmless act, would soon explode into one of the biggest public scandals the airline industry had ever seen. As the clippers buzzed to life, he caught the faintest whiff of tension in the air. He couldn't see the faces behind him, but he could hear their muffled chuckles. "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" he asked casually. "Oh, yes, sir," one of them said, the sarcasm barely hidden. "We'll make you look brand new." And then, with one reckless sweep, the clipper ran straight through the center of his head. Charles froze, his heart thudding. He turned toward the mirror, disbelief spreading through his face as he saw a jagged strip of hair missing from the top of his head. "What are you doing?" he snapped, standing up. The attendants burst into laughter. "Relax, sir. It's just a joke," one of them said between fits of amusement. The woman from the counter appeared at the door, recording on her phone, laughing so hard she could barely breathe. Oh my God, you actually let them do it." Charles' breath caught in his chest. The humiliation hit him like a wave, the laughter, the recording, the looks. A grown man, a leader, a CEO who had built his legacy with dignity and intellect, reduced to the butt of a cool, racist joke. He clenched his fists, shaking. "Delete that video. Right now." The woman only grinned wider. "What, you don't like your new haircut, so?" "Delete it." But before he could take another step, airport security walked in, alerted by the commotion. Instead of helping, they sided with the employees, assuming Charles was the aggressor. "Sir, please calm down," one guard ordered. "You're disturbing other passengers." "I've just been assaulted," Charles said, his voice trembling with both fury and disbelief. They humiliated me, cut my hair without permission, and they're recording it. Sir, we'll handle this, the guard said dismissively, clearly uninterested. Let's not make this worse for yourself. That sentence, make this worse for yourself, echoed like poison in Charles' mind. He knew exactly what it meant. A warning often reserved for black men who dared to protest their mistreatment. He stood there, humiliated, hair uneven and dignity bleeding out at him in front of strangers' curious eyes. The staff kept laughing, whispering, their phones raised like weapons. One of them even mocked. Don't worry, sir, we'll post it online with a hashtag #firstclass style. Charles walked out slowly, forcing every step to stay calm. Every eye in the lounge followed him, some in pity, most in judgment. But beneath the surface, something inside him hardened. This wasn't going to end quietly. As he reached his gate, he opened his phone, and his world tilted. The video was already online, posted by an anonymous account with the caption, CEO or clown, Airline's new VIP look. It had already gone viral. Thousands of likes, comments mocking his appearance, and racist jokes flooding in. Each comment was a knife. Charles' hand trembled as he closed the app. He looked out the airport window, his reflection staring back at him, a man who had spent his life fighting for respect in a world determined to deny it. For a moment, he wanted to disappear. But then, slowly, he straightened his posture. They had no idea who they had just humiliated. He picked up his phone again, scrolled to his contacts, and called his assistant. His voice was calm but cold as steel. Lydia, he said, cancel the London meeting, and find me the contact number for the Federal Aviation Board. There was a pause. Sir, is everything all right? Charles stared out at the tarmac where his flight waited, the engines humming faintly in the distance. No, he said quietly, but it will be. He hung up and began to type an email that would ignite a firestorm, one that would shake the airline industry, destroy reputations, and make the world remember the name Charles Bennett not as a victim, but as a man who turned humiliation into power. When Charles Bennett walked out of that airport, he carried not just humiliation, he carried the spark of something dangerous, something righteous. The same hands that had built an empire from the dust were now trembling, not from fear, but from fury sharpened by years of knowing exactly how the world worked for men who looked like him. He didn't go home that night. He went straight to his office. The city skyline glowed behind him as the clock hit midnight, but Charles didn't even notice the hour. The viral video, the one showing his humiliation, had now crossed over 1 million views. Every major social platform was feeding on it. The video had been captioned crudely, CEO gets free haircut, airline style. The comment section was worse. That's what happens when they think they belong in first class. He should be grateful they even touched his hair. Just a joke. People, relax. It wasn't just a joke anymore. It was a national conversation, except no one yet knew who the man in the video was. Charles hadn't spoken publicly. He was still a faceless victim to the online crowd. But that was about to change. He poured himself a glass of water, took a deep breath, and began typing an email, not to his PR team, not to the press, but to his legal division, his board, and his trusted partners. The subject line read, Immediate response to defamatory incident, legal and strategic action plan. Within 20 minutes, his inbox lit up. His corporate counsel, Denise Harris, called him directly. Charles, I just saw the video. Please tell me this isn't real. It's real, he said evenly, and it's about to become much more real for that airline. She exhaled sharply. You realize what you're about to do, right? This could become explosive. That's a multi-billion-dollar carrier. Charles' tone hardened. And I'm a black man who's been laughed at in front of the world. I built this company from the ground up, Denise. If I stay silent, I'm telling every young black kid in this country that their dignity is negotiable. It's not. By dawn, his team had gathered in his office, a dozen men and women who had helped shape Bennett Dynamics into a powerhouse. They sat around the long mahogany table as Charles stood at the head, wearing a simple black turtleneck and slacks. His half-shaved head was still visible, a raw reminder of the cruelty he'd endured. So, one of his advisors said, if we go public, this will destroy that airline's image. But they'll fight back. They'll call it a misunderstanding, a prank gone wrong. They'll weaponize their PR to make you look unreasonable. Charles smiled faintly. Then we'll remind them that reason has nothing to do with racism. He turned to the large screen behind him and clicked a remote. A slideshow appeared, screenshots of the video, the comments, the employee faces, and the logo on their uniforms. Every frame was evidence. We're not going to shout, Charles said calmly. We're going to prove, and when the truth lands, we'll make sure it hits so hard that no corporation in America ever laughs at a black man again. By noon, his legal team had already drafted a 42-page complaint for racial harassment, physical assault, and public defamation. But Charles wasn't done. He didn't just want justice. He wanted accountability. He personally called the Federal Aviation Board and the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department. I'd like to report a serious breach of passenger safety and human rights abuse by one of your certified airlines, he said firmly. And I have video proof. The silence on the other end was brief but heavy. Sir, may we have your name? Charles Bennett, he replied, CEO of Bennett Dynamics. The pause that followed was almost electric. Within hours, every major newsroom in the country had picked up the breaking headline. Billionaire CEO publicly humiliated by airline staff, FBI and FAA involved. The same people who laughed at the video in the morning were now deleting their comments by the evening. The internet had turned on the airline with vengeance. #JusticeForCharles began trending worldwide. People were outraged, not just because of what had happened, but because of what it symbolized. It wasn't just one man's humiliation. It was every story of disrespect, every denial of dignity that black professionals had endured silently in corporate boardrooms, airports, and public spaces. The airline, cornered and panicking, released a statement. We deeply regret the misunderstanding involving one of our valued passengers. The staff involved have been suspended pending investigation. But Charles didn't respond publicly. Not yet. He knew silence was more powerful when the world was screaming for his words. Instead, he prepared for his next move. A day later, he received an unexpected call. It was from the airline CEO, a man named Richard Langford. Smooth, diplomatic, and desperate. Mr. Bennett, Langford began, I want to extend my deepest apologies. I assure you this was not in line with our company values. We'd like to resolve this quietly and respectfully. Charles let out a slow breath. Quietly, he repeated. You humiliated me in front of millions of people, and you want quiet. Please understand, this could be damaging to both of us. You're a respected figure, and... Charles cut him off. Mr. Langford, your staff mocked my skin, my hair, my humanity. They treated me like a spectacle. The damage isn't mine, it's yours. The airline CEO's voice cracked slightly. What are you asking for? Charles leaned back in his chair. The truth, publicly. A full statement admitting what happened. Compensation is not for me but for a foundation that supports black entrepreneurs who face discrimination. And every employee involved was fired, not suspended. Langford hesitated. That's a lot. Charles's tone dropped like ice. Then I'll see you in court and in the headlines. Again. He hung up. By the next morning, things had escalated. The FBI had officially opened an investigation after claims surfaced that the video was deliberately leaked and monetized by one of the employees for profit. The case had crossed from a PR scandal into potential criminal charges. Charles watched it unfold from his office. News anchors replayed the footage on loop, each frame dissected, each laugh analyzed. Civil rights groups called for protests. Social media flooded with posts from people sharing their own stories of racial humiliation in public spaces. He received thousands of messages from strangers, from fellow CEOs, and from black parents thanking him for standing tall. You turned their joke into our power, one message read. But it wasn't just about revenge for Charles anymore. It was about transformation. He called his assistant again. Lydia, he said, we're setting up a press conference. Tomorrow morning. What should I title the statement? He thought for a long moment. Call it the cost of a joke. That night, alone in his penthouse, Charles stood before the mirror. His hair was still uneven, the memory of those cool hands still vivid. But there was something else in his eyes now, something fierce. He whispered to his reflection, "You thought you broke me. You just built me again, stronger." The morning sun rose behind a line of skyscrapers that glimmered like glass towers of judgment. Outside the Bennett Dynamics headquarters, a sea of reporters waited, cameras poised, microphones raised, anticipation hanging in the air like the hum before a storm. Charles Bennett stepped out of a sleek black car, wearing a charcoal suit and no hat. He wanted them to see his head, the uneven, half-shaved hair that had become a global symbol of humiliation and defiance. His stride was calm, his face unreadable, but every step he took carried the weight of history, not just his own, but of every person who had ever been mocked, underestimated, or dismissed because of the color of their skin. As he approached the podium, the murmur of the crowd grew louder. Cameras clicked like gunfire. A few reporters shouted his name, trying to break the silence he carried like armor. But he didn't speak until the microphones were ready, until the world had no choice but to listen. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady but deep, every word deliberate. "A few days ago, an incident occurred at Gate 17 of Jefferson International Airport. I was publicly humiliated, physically assaulted, and mocked by airline staff because of my hair, my appearance, and my identity." The flashes went off again, but he didn't flinch. It was called a joke. But a joke built on someone's pain is never funny. It's violence disguised as humor. He paused, letting that sentence hang, then continued. "Many of you have seen the video. You laughed, or maybe you shared it. But what you didn't see was a history that came with it. You didn't see a black man who grew up being told his hair was unprofessional, his voice too loud, his presence too much. You didn't see a world that still demands black excellence while mocking black existence." A hush fell over the crowd. Every eye was fixed on him now, not the billionaire, not the CEO, but the man standing alone in front of the world, speaking truth with raw fire. Charles lifted a folder from a podium and held it up. "This," he said, "is a formal complaint filed against North Air Airlines for racial harassment, assault, and defamation. This is not about revenge. This is about accountability, about saying, once and for all, that dignity is not up for negotiation." Behind him, the large screen lit up with the airline's logo, followed by screenshots of their social media statement, and then the now infamous video. But what came next froze everyone. It was new footage, unreleased security camera clips that Charles' legal team had obtained through a whistleblower inside the airport. The video showed the staff laughing before he arrived, one of them holding up scissors, saying, "Let's see if he still looks like a boss when we're done." The audience gasped. Journalists whispered urgently, fumbling to type their notes faster. Charles continued calmly. This was not a misunderstanding. This was premeditated humiliation. Within minutes, the live broadcast exploded across every network and platform. Millions watched, their jaws dropping at the evidence. North Air's stock began to plummet, a visual crash unfolding in real time. A reporter finally broke the silence. "Mr. Bennett, what do you hope to achieve from all this?" Charles turned toward her, his eyes sharp but kind. "Change," he said simply. "Real, structural change. For too long, companies have written apology letters instead of rewriting their values. I want this to be the last time a person is publicly mocked for who they are." Another reporter asked, "Is it true the FBI is involved?" He nodded slightly. "Yes. Because when a company profits from humiliation, when employees conspire to record and leak footage for entertainment, that's no longer a prank. That's exploitation. And that's a federal matter." The press conference ended with thunderous applause from the crowd outside. Protesters holding signs, "Respect black dignity. We are not your joke," filled the sidewalks. Charles didn't smile. He just walked away quietly, knowing the battle had only begun. By evening, the media storm had reached a fever pitch. News anchors debated whether the airline would survive the fallout. Talk shows invited civil rights leaders and corporate ethics experts to weigh in. The airline's public relations department went into overdrive, releasing another statement. "We are deeply saddened by the events and have terminated the employees responsible. We are working closely with federal authorities to ensure full transparency." But it was too late. Their credibility had evaporated. Behind closed doors, the North Air boardroom was chaos. Executives argued, investors shouted, and the CEO, Richard Langford, sat with his head in his hands. One board member slammed a file onto the table. "We're losing millions every hour. Bennett just killed our public image." Langford stood slowly. "This isn't just PR damage. The DOJ and FAA are calling for hearings. They might revoke our operating license if this goes further." "It will go further," said another. "You humiliated the wrong man." Meanwhile, Charles sat in his apartment that night, watching the news quietly. The footage of the protests outside the airline's headquarters played in the background. Lydia, his assistant, stood beside him. "You did it," she said softly. "You made them see." Charles shook his head. "Not yet. Seeing isn't the same as changing. But we're closer." He turned off the TV and looked out the window at the city lights. For a moment, he remembered the sound of laughter in that airport, how sharp it had been, how small they had made him feel. But now, the same laughter had become the sound of their downfall. Across town, the FBI offices were buzzing. Agents reviewed the footage, cross-referencing employee records. One agent looked up from her computer. "So, it looks like the employees were part of a private chat group where they planned the prank, and they sold the footage to a gossip page for $10,000. Her superior frowned. "Then it's no longer just a PR stunt. That's criminal intent and profit from assault." The next morning, FBI vans arrived at North Air's regional headquarters. Employees were let out in handcuffs. The footage was live-streamed, poetic irony for those who had started it all. The media called it the corporate reckoning. Charles didn't gloat. He didn't post. He simply walked into a community center in Atlanta that afternoon, one that he had funded years ago. Children were playing, families laughing. A young boy with short curls ran up to him. "Mr. Bennett, I saw you on TV. You weren't scared, were you?" Charles smiled for the first time in days. "I was," he said honestly. "But being scared doesn't mean we stop standing up." The boy nodded, thinking deeply. "When I grow up, I want to be like you. I want to own stuff too." Charles knelt down. "Then start by owning your voice. Son, everything else follows." That night, he sat at his desk and began writing something new, a personal letter to every CEO he knew in the Fortune 500. The subject line read, "Diversity is not a department, it's a duty." The letter began with one sentence. "The next time you laugh at a man's hair, remember, you might just be laughing at your company's downfall." The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that only truth could summon. Rows of journalists, attorneys, and onlookers filled every seat. The air smelled faintly of old wood and tension. On one side sat North Air Airlines' legal team, a wall of suits and polished shoes. On the other, Charles Bennett, calm, resolute, dressed in a simple black suit that seemed to absorb every whisper in the room. Judge Morales, a woman known for her fierce sense of justice, looked over her glasses at both sides. "This court has reviewed the evidence thoroughly," she began, "and what we've seen goes beyond workplace misconduct. It's a systemic failure of respect, accountability, and humanity." Her words landed like thunderclaps. The screens behind her displayed the final pieces of evidence. Internal emails between airline staff mocking Bennett's reaction, laughing about how the billionaire will survive the haircut. One message even read, "He should thank us for giving him some publicity." Charles kept his gaze forward. He didn't need revenge. He needed this to mean something. Judge Morales continued, her tone unwavering. "When public humiliation becomes entertainment, and when a corporation protects such behavior, it's not merely bad business, it's a crime of conscience." The room held its breath. "In light of overwhelming evidence," she declared, "this court finds North Air Airlines guilty of gross negligence, racial harassment, and violation of federal civil rights laws. The company's operational license will be suspended pending federal review, and a fine of $480 million is imposed to fund anti-discrimination programs and community equity initiatives nationwide." Gasps filled the courtroom. Reporters typed furiously. The CEO of North Air, pale, trembling, stared blankly as the weight of a company's ruin settled on her shoulders. But Charles didn't smile. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and approached the microphone when permitted to speak. "Your Honor," he began, voice firm but soft. "I accept this verdict, not for myself, but for every person who has been laughed at, doubted, or diminished simply for being who they are." He glanced briefly at the audience, faces of young people, civil rights activists, and workers who had traveled from across the country to witness this moment. "I was humiliated in public, but that pain became a mirror. It showed how far we still have to go as society. This isn't about me. It's about restoring the dignity that should have never been taken away." When he finished, there was no applause, just silence, the kind that meant people were thinking. Deeply, outside, the city erupted. News anchors called it the fall of North Air. Social media exploded with hashtags, #respect is power, #Bennett verdict, #no more jokes. Protesters and supporters flooded the courthouse steps. Cameras captured every second. Charles walking down the marble stairs, surrounded by flashing lights, his calm face glowing in the late afternoon sun. A reporter shouted, "Mr. Bennett, what's next for you?" He paused. "Building something better," he said simply. "If one company can destroy respect, then another can rebuild it." And that's exactly what he did. 3 months later, a new initiative was born, the Dignity Project, a corporate reform movement founded by Charles Bennett to educate companies on equity, diversity, and human worth. It began as a small nonprofit, but soon expanded globally, training leaders, reshaping corporate culture, and inspiring businesses to see diversity not as an obligation but as a strength. Every keynote Charles delivered was packed. People wanted to hear from the man who had turned humiliation into reform. His first major speech, held in Atlanta's Civic Hall, was broadcast worldwide. "I'm not here to talk about my pain," he said, standing beneath a banner that read "Respect has no price." "I'm here to talk about what pain can teach us. I was stripped of dignity in public, and it taught me that no amount of money, power, or title replaces self-respect. You can build an empire, but if it stands on mockery, it will crumble." The crowd erupted in applause. He continued, his tone more reflective now. "We've learned to chase profit, not principle, to measure worth in numbers, not in humanity. But today, I ask you, what's a company worth if its people are ashamed to work for it? What's a brand worth if its success depends on breaking others down?" A pause. Then he smiled slightly. "It's time we stop teaching employees how to serve customers and start teaching leaders how to sow dignity." The impact was electric. Within a year, dozens of corporations signed on to the Dignity Project's Code of Ethics. Universities invited him to speak. The United Nations recognized the initiative for advancing workplace equality. But Charles stayed humble. He spent weekends visiting community centers, mentoring young black entrepreneurs, funding scholarships, and rebuilding trust where institutions had failed. One afternoon, as he left a youth seminar, he was approached by a woman in her 60s, a former North Air employee. Her eyes were teary. "I was part of that airport team," she confessed. "I didn't touch you or laugh, but I didn't stop them either. I've lived with that guilt. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." Charles looked at her, saw the sincerity, the shame, the years of silence, and nodded. "You've said it," he replied gently. "Now use it. Teach others what you've learned. That's how we make it right." She cried softly, and he placed a hand on her shoulder. Forgiveness wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. By the second year, the story of Charles Bennett had become more than a corporate scandal. It was a parable of justice. News outlets produced documentaries titled "The Man Who Brought Down an Airline" and "When Dignity Took Flight." But Charles didn't care about fame. He often said, "Justice is not a headline, it's a habit." And yet, fate had one more twist to deliver. One evening, as he arrived at a gala celebrating the Dignity Project expansion into Africa, he saw a new face in the crowd, the son of Richard Langford, the ex-CEO of North Air. The young man approached nervously. "My father wanted to thank you," he said quietly. "He lost everything, but he told me he learned what real leadership looks like. He said you did what he should have done, stood up for people." Charles took a deep breath. The air felt lighter somehow. "Tell your father," he said, "it's never too late to stand up, even if you have to start by kneeling in humility." The young man smiled faintly and walked away. As the music began, Charles stood at the balcony overlooking the city skyline. Below, lights shimmered like stars that had fallen to earth, a city reborn from conscience. He thought of that day at the airport, the laughter, the cameras, the sharp sting of humiliation. And now, here he was, not broken, but rebuilt. He whispered to himself, "They shave my head, but not my worth." At that moment, Lydia walked up beside him. "You know," she said softly, "you didn't just bring down an airline. You lifted people up." Charles smiled, watching the city below. "That's all I ever wanted to do." And as the camera panned out, lights glowing, people celebrating, and one man standing tall in the twilight, the voiceover faded in. They mocked his hair, not knowing they were cutting their own wings. Because when you strip a man of dignity, you awaken the power that restores it. The music swelled, the lights dimmed, and the story of Charles Bennett, the man whose humiliation became a movement, ended not with vengeance, but with victory.